On June 12, 2026, something happened that had never happened in the entire recorded history of human commerce. One person crossed $1 trillion in net worth. Not a country. Not a company. One man. Elon Musk. Here is the full story of how he got there, why it happened faster than anyone predicted, and why the number is simultaneously the most impressive and the most complicated figure in financial history. Start with the scale, because without context this number means nothing. $1 billion is already beyond most people's ability to imagine. If you spent $27,000 every single day for 100 years, you would barely spend $1 billion. $1 trillion is 1,000 of those. At $1 trillion, you could spend $27 million every single day for a century and still not run out. The entire annual budget of NASA, one of SpaceX's biggest customers, is $24.5 billion. Musk's fortune at its peak was more than 50 times that, in a single personal net worth figure. Now here is where it gets interesting. 3 years ago, in the summer of 2024, Musk, Jeff Bezos and Bernard Arnault were swapping the title of world's richest person almost daily. All three were hovering around $200 billion. That is already an incomprehensible figure. But they were all roughly in the same conversation. Not anymore. The acceleration that followed is almost without precedent. Musk's net worth hit $300 billion in 2021, $400 billion in December 2024, $500 billion in October 2025, $600 and $700 billion in December 2025, $800 billion in February 2026, and $900 billion in June 2026. Then on June 12, it crossed $1 trillion in a single day. One company. One IPO. Done. That company is SpaceX. And understanding why SpaceX changed everything requires understanding what Musk has been building quietly for 20 years while the world was arguing about Tesla. SpaceX's IPO raised enough capital to make it the largest public offering in history, far surpassing every previous record. The company priced its shares at $135 on listing day. Retail investors chasing the dream of Mars settlements and AI-powered data centers in space pushed the stock to $225 within 4 days. Musk's net worth briefly reached $1.4 trillion at that peak. Let that sink in. $1.4 trillion. In a single human lifetime. Now here is the part the headlines largely skipped. Most of that wealth is freshly public SpaceX stock that Musk largely cannot sell during the post-IPO lockup period. This is not a pile of cash. It is not money sitting in a bank. The gap between his paper fortune and what he could actually spend tomorrow is the most important number nobody talks about when they report these headlines. In practice, even the hint that Musk might sell a significant chunk of his SpaceX or Tesla holdings could crash their market value overnight. The wealth is real on paper. Accessing it is a different story entirely. But the math is still extraordinary. Musk already held about $279 billion in Tesla stock before SpaceX even listed. After SpaceX's IPO, his stake in that company alone added close to $1 trillion on top of it. The combined figure from just those two companies is something no individual had ever touched before in any currency, at any point in history. The historical comparison that keeps coming up is John D. Rockefeller. When Rockefeller's wealth was estimated at $900 million in 1913, it represented 2.3% of the entire U.S. gross domestic product. When Musk's wealth hit $970 billion in early June 2026, it represented 3% of U.S. GDP. So by that measure, Musk is actually more dominant relative to the entire economy than the most famous robber baron in American history. Whether you like it or not, that comparison is now part of the official record. The road here was not a straight line. Tesla nearly destroyed him financially in 2018. He publicly said he was weeks away from bankruptcy in that year. The Delaware court spent years trying to strip back his compensation package before the Supreme Court restored it in December 2025. Tesla's first quarter profits in 2026 fell 71% year-over-year. A Yale study attributed more than 1 million lost U.S. vehicle sales to the political backlash against Musk personally. The company that was supposed to be his financial foundation was wobbling badly at the exact same time SpaceX was preparing to make him the wealthiest person in history. In theory, a CEO whose main consumer brand is actively losing customers due to political controversy should be in financial trouble. In practice, SpaceX exists in a completely separate category where none of those rules apply. Rockets, satellites, government contracts, and the global infrastructure of the Internet through Starlink are not affected by whether someone in Germany refuses to buy a car. And this brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. At over $1 trillion, Musk's fortune is nearly 4 times the size of the second richest person on Earth. The next 4 wealthiest individuals combined, Larry Page, Sergey Brin, Jeff Bezos and Larry Ellison, total just over $1 trillion between them. One man versus the 4 next richest people on the planet. He wins. There is a version of this story that ends neatly with a number and a headline. The real story is more complicated. The first trillionaire in history got there through 2 decades of rocket launches that blew up before they worked. A car company that nearly went bankrupt twice. A series of legal battles that dragged on for years. And a political chapter that cost him customers and credibility simultaneously. And despite all of it, or possibly because of the chaos that came with all of it, he still ended up somewhere nobody in history had ever stood before. $1 trillion. First in history. Not clean. Not simple. But done. Subscribe for more stories about money, power, and history.